Thank you for Professor Mitrovic for your kind invitation to talk about my work in open system development and how it might be applied to mathematics education. My name is Ian Benson. I'm a mathematician and informatics researcher working with teachers through the United Kingdom Association of Teachers of Mathematics, the ATM. We've been studying how school mathematics and informatics might be taught as a single subject. I use the term informatics as the proper name for this science rather than computing or computer science, since both computing equipment and people are actors in information systems. Kristen Nigo, who proposed this broader context for computer science, argued that the best strategy in democratic problem solving is a common understanding of the world. He pioneered object-oriented system description as a step towards that understanding. In this way, the informatics approach to mathematics education becomes essential for active citizenship. Informatics is the applied mathematics of the 21st century. My talk has three strands. I start by contrasting two approaches to learning. In the traditional approach, due to Jean Piaget, the stages of a child's intellectual development grow over the first 6 years of education from a very weak base. In the beginning, Piaget maintained, the child is apparently not capable of logical thought. The stage of formal logical reasoning is not reached until they leave primary school at the age of 11. The other approach is due to Caleb Guiteneau. He was founding secretary and director of studies of the ATM. He maintained that the mental powers present in the infant brain are sufficient to master algebra in grade 1. Indeed, he aimed to show this with a series of textbooks that the whole primary mathematics curriculum could be covered in 18 months. Next, I model the dialogue between the teacher as witness and the learner as seen by Guiteneau. I take the perspective of language action theory. In a LAT model, the didactic situation is viewed as a communicating concurrent system. Its behaviour is represented as a conversation straight transition network with negotiated conditions of satisfaction. Mathematics education becomes the cultivation of an inner witness to observe without involvement while the learner is caught up in action. I draw a parallel between this algebra first approach to pedagogy in mathematics and the teaching of object-oriented programming, which also begins with modelling a complex situation as an algebraic data type. I report 3 case studies of computer-supported societal networks and suggest that mathematics education meets the requirement for an open system development that can scale. We start though with a short clip of an 8-month-old child catching a ball. Make some notes while you watch this clip. What do you witness? The first 3 transits of the ball ended in front of the baby, but the 4th stopped short. Let's slow that down. What we see is that the baby is moving his hands to the place where the ball would have reached if it hadn't been prematurely stopped short. This is evidence that the baby was engaged in a synthesis of perception and action that we now understand is a mixture of top-down anticipation and bottom-up sensory perception. Guiteneau believed that learners could be educated to fine-tune their sensitivity to this anticipation. In his Science of Education, he called this unit of study an awareness. He wrote, "We can become aware that before we utter the first word of a sentence, something in us knows where to go to find all the words needed to express our thought. Putting the words in order, affecting them by number, gender, attributes, time modalities, etc." Guiteneau reached his conclusion by introspection, that is, he studied himself and how he worked as a pure mathematician. 50 years on, much of his analysis has been confirmed through computer science, neurobiology, and cognitive psychology. Stav Duhen, a neuroscientist, put it this way in his How We Learn the New Science of Education. Even before they acquire their first words, children possess a kind of language of thought within which they can formulate and test abstract hypotheses. From birth, the child's brain must already possess two key ingredients: all the machinery that makes it possible to generate a plethora of abstract thought, a combinatorial language of thought, and the ability to choose from these formulas wisely according to their plausibility given the data. In the 1950s, Guiteneau and Piaget worked together in a commission for the improvement of mathematics teaching. Piaget and his followers, notably Seymour Papert, who followed Guiteneau as Piaget's math specialist in the late 1950s, inspired the textbooks that are used in Anglo-American schools and MIT's Scratch language, which uses parameterized drawings to teach aspects of coding. Their approach emphasizes counting first and then the four operations in successive years, and finally fractions as magnitudes, as functions, and then algebra. A similar proto-curriculum is followed in Asian schools, although more emphasis is placed on measurement and relational reasoning from the outset. Schools we've been working with, so-called Tizod schools, explore Guiteneau's insight that what Dehaene now calls the learner's combinatorial language of thought could be made explicit in operations with coloured rods, as seen here, and in algebraic writing, where letter codes represent the lengths of the rods. Guiteneau's close collaborator, Madeleine Guittard, who did much to coach teachers in the algebra-first approach, took issue with the very idea that mathematics itself could be taught.
Why? Because in this expression, we put mathematics as something already made, which exists by itself, but for the children it don't. So I prefer another approach. When the children are like mathematicians, the mathematics come out of them and not receiving from.
If mathematics is to be internally generated and not externally imposed on the learner, what are the elements of their mental processes, and how can we educate the learner to appreciate them? The key to Guiteneau's approach is a structure of mathematical activity that flows as a cycle from actions and perceptions mediated by imagery through to technical language, symbols and notation. Action is using an array of fingers or Cuisenaire rods. Virtual action uses imagery generated by the action. Speaking is language that describes the imagery, and writing includes specialized symbols and notation. In a classroom setting, the teacher, here as witness, prompts the learner by posing a mathematical question, a mathematizing situation. This stimulates the student to take action that invokes imagery, which represents a perception, which may in turn guide virtual action or action again in the world. Guiteneau calls this the phase of awareness, during which the learner is immersed in the problem. Imagery serves a second purpose. It prefigures the spoken language that in turn uses definitions written using symbols and notation that might invoke additional imagery. Note that these two cycles, awareness and facility, take place at the same time. The learner here on the right of the animation may be simultaneously imagining and recognizing an experience, at the same time being immersed in it and separated from it. Guittard introduced early algebra with the coloured rods from year 1 by giving letter code names to them. Here, small g is light green and W is white. She recorded the relationship between the lengths of trains of rods end to end in the form of an equation. This free writing uses juxtaposition for append, numbers here as multiples, not yet integers, and equality for equals, the equal sign for equality. At the outset, the coloured rods fall into a pattern or a staircase. Here the length of successive rods are multiples of the side of the white square. Teaching algebra with their aid from year 1 is a proven technique documented by Gitenio in his textbooks. We allied his named diagram approach to a software development environment and introduced it to learners in year 2, age 7, in an experimental functional programming course in the language Haskell. The figure shows 2 windows: an engine where the data and functions are defined, and an interpreter that records commands and returns results. The first thing we noticed was that students were keen to explore the boundaries of what could be expressed. Here a student experiments with the derived successor and predecessor functions inherited from the Haskell standard enumerated data class. The log on the right shows the student's work. What we found was that given the freedom to explore the state space, even with a limited domain-specific language of 10 data elements and 2 functions, the learners were keen to investigate function composition. The successor of the successor of the predecessor of the predecessor of green is green. The second thing we found was that by removing every other rod from the staircase, and similarly every second data element from the data type, students could effectively reason about the meaning.
What have you done? Are you doing suck, or what was the other one? Crib.
I'm doing suck.
Okay, and what does that mean? What does that mean you do?
It means like if I do suck, you add one number on. Like if I had 6 and I done suck, it will equal 7.
Okay, all right, and then you do it as
It's actual 8 because there's no odd.
Equational reasoning is at the heart of mathematics and informatics, seen as an integrated curriculum. What we've just witnessed is what John Mason calls a lived experience of simultaneous immersion and separation. It's possible, he says, to develop an inner witness or monitor which observes without involvement while the predicated I is immersed, fully involved and caught up in the action. This is a much more than a post-event introspection or reflection. Its origins are ancient. For example, it's hinted at by the image of 2 birds found in the ancient text of Rig Veda. I apply Winograd and Flores' language action theory to dig deeper into the structure of the conversation of the kind we've just witnessed. They developed this theory in their classic book, Understanding Computers and Cognition. In it, they classify utterances in a dialogue intended for action into a small number of categories which fall into a regular pattern. The structure of what they call a typical conversation for action is a state change protocol in which the arcs are labelled by party A or counterpart B and the type of speech act such as request or promise. States or nodes are labelled by decision agents in which A or B choose to advance, renegotiate or abort the transaction. We can apply this framework to the didactic situation we've just witnessed. A is the questioner, B is the learner who interrupted him. In the normal course of events, the conversation would have gone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But as we saw at state 4, the learner corrected himself. He spoke out over A's declaration of satisfaction and rolled the conversation back to state 3. He then asserts the answer is actually 8 because there are no odd. Combining Gitenio's process model with functional programming concepts, I obtain a new template for mathematical cognition. This abstracts the notion of a conceptual model as something that is personal, that the learner as developer can apply to thinking about their thinking. It offers her a way of checking her work, while for an actor in an information system, the conceptual model will provide the opportunity to establish or validate that the implemented system meets their requirements. Thus far, we've looked at LAT as a lens to view the didactic situation. We'll now zoom out and examine what it brings to a world in which independence of thinking is prized. We will look briefly at the application of the LAT approach to computer-supported self-organized networks. In pedagogics, a well-known principle is that basic concepts should be taught first. More difficult and composite concepts should come later, after the basic ones are understood and mastered. Object-oriented programming is intended to comprehend and organize complexity. Its basic concepts are objects, classes, inheritance with objects having attributes, virtuals and action sequences, or threads that might run concurrently. Teaching object-oriented programming must therefore begin with exposing students to complex situations that may only be mastered by understanding and using these concepts. Nigod stated that in this way, information technology opens up a wider range of alternatives for the organisation of society, and it may be used in the development and support of human skills and cooperation. Teaching object-oriented programming thus must begin with exposing students to complex situations that may only be mastered by understanding and using these concepts. Michael Nielsen has studied open source collaborations that scale. He noted 4 attributes they all share. They are committed to working in a modular way. They encourage small contributions which make it easy to get involved. They allow easy reuse of early work by other people, and they use signalling methods such as citation indexes or scores to help people to decide where to direct their attention. The fundamental requirement, he says, is that participants must share a body of knowledge or techniques such as found in mathematics, programming or chess. Thus far we've examined how informatics can strengthen mathematical understanding, but the relationship goes both ways. Martin Lerf, in his seminal paper on constructive mathematics and computer programming, highlighted mathematical constructs that correspond to computing concepts. In particular, the correspondence between programs, procedures, and algorithms and functions, and data types and sets. Within functional programming, there's a further distinction between program specification as a type signature and its implementation through equations and pattern matching. Program execution proceeds by substitution and equational reasoning. Conceptual mathematics or category theory goes further. It elucidates this correspondence with types as objects and functions as morphisms. As we've seen, functional programming enables learners to reason about the behavior of programs. This is helpful on the one hand for the developer to verify their implementation fulfills its specification, and on the other hand, it can enable users to validate that their requirements are met. This is something that is difficult in general to ensure in information system development, where the system logic is rarely transparent. Nigod distinguishes properties of the information system from properties of the way it's developed. He notes that these are not independent. In the absence of co-design tools for system description and validation, we will continue to experience problems with large-scale development. Nigod calls the connection between these processes a process structure hierarchy, and he highlights 3 levels. The information process, that's the execution of programs and data processing by people and machines. The system development process, which has the structure of the information process or the modification of its structure as its product. And thirdly, the process of learning within organizations, the research process, how the organization adapts to a changed environment. We're going to look at three cases of how computer-supported networks enable teachers, pilots, and political activists to organize themselves. In our first study, we used Google's Ngram to measure the frequency with which the term Cuisinart-Guiteneau and Cuisinart-Guiteneau appear in the literature from the inception of the ATM to today. The graph reflects teachers and teacher educators forming a worldwide scientific community to create learning and teaching aids, conduct experiments, peer review experimental results, and curate resources. The Cuisenaire rods today attract more coverage than they ever have. Interest in the Algebra First curriculum, named after Cuisenaire and Grattanio, faded after the 70s. Our replication and extension of that work has reached 30 schools. This was made possible by adapting the archived teaching materials to the latter approach and using specialist software, iPads and electronic whiteboards to plan, record and assess lessons. There was a rapid escalation of our work, which now reaches 30 schools and 600 student years, after 2014, when a new national curriculum in the United Kingdom set out a legal duty on schools to teach all 4 operations and unit fractions as operators together for small numbers. In Haskell, this is called an algebraic data type. My second example is the bid-line flight crew scheduling process, which was negotiated by the British Airline Pilots Association with British Airways to allow pilots to express their preferences for loops of flights out from and back to a UK home airport. The rules at the time permitted senior pilots to have their pick of these so-called bid lines. More junior flight crew had to fill in the gaps in successive rounds of bidding. The annual allocation of work to 3,500 pilots was represented as several 100,000 conversations for action. Each was concerned with allocating a pilot to a cockpit sit on a particular bid line. Here the conversation is a negotiation between the pilots P and the airline A. It is generally asynchronous. The bid line routine is initiated by the offer of the open schedule by the scheduling officer, SO. It proceeds through 6 invocations for each 4-week period, distinguished only by the rules for resolving conflicts. There are 13 4-week periods per annum, and at any one time there may be 3 consecutive periods being allocated, with constraints on flying hours, for example, that apply across adjacent schedules. The allocation process for each period is a recursive call on the conversation state transition diagram shown here. The resolving agent, SBS, applies rules to allocate the pilots to flights according to the depth of the recursion. The pilot's interface to the information system is imputed from the transition diagram. It is interpreted as a Petrinet with bids as tokens, speech acts as transitions or menu items, and decision agents as states. My third example is the negotiation between the approximately 700 accounting units of the Labour Party and the party funding manager. He is legally required to report each quarter donations in cash or kind that have accumulated over the year above a certain threshold. These reports are placed in the public domain by the UK Electoral Commission and consolidated into an overall graphic, as shown here for quarter 4, 2001. The figure shows the 2 counterparties in the state change conversations, namely the responsible officer in each accounting unit that receives the money and the central funding manager who is responsible for reporting to the Electoral Commission. The system design is complicated by the fact that donations may be reported in a later quarter than the one where they were received, so it's necessary each quarter to go back and recalculate all prior periods. The donations themselves flow through the conversation as tokens, which may be clean for acceptable or grey for rejected if, for example, they're coming not from a UK registered voter or company. Whatever happens, the Electoral Commission needs a report. Aggregation by donor follows upwards from the accounting units through to the head office. Decision agents are modelled as predicates, that is, functions of the donor, the accounting unit and the reporting period. One predicate delta reports amounts over the threshold, and a second delta star aggregates the remaining donations across all units for the donor. This may trigger a so-called Schedule 62 report, or it may be carried forward to the next quarter. The 16 possible reporting pathways for a donor can be illustrated as a labelled transition network. This one serves to enumerate test cases that enables the party funding manager to verify that he's complying with the law. In conclusion, maths education is at a crossroads. On the one hand, there are multiple proprietary online systems for learning and teaching mathematics. They have opaque curricula and contrived problems. Systems of this kind can reduce teachers to machine minders and learners to mind-numbing repetition. As Nielsen noted, there are open source collaborations such as chess with 100 million chess.com users or mathematics with Project Euler. We can be optimistic that with proper attention to the professional development of teachers and the development of co-design tools for new information technologies, we can achieve a more accessible mathematical culture. Thank you for listening. I'd be very happy to take any questions.